Hi there. My name is Trudy Brown, and I'm the Director of Learning and Grantmaking here at the Steelcase Foundation. Today, I'll be recording an information session for prospective nonprofit applicants and help them understand our general approach to grant making, our priorities, currently our application process, and answer some frequently asked questions that we receive. I'll start by sharing how we think about partnership, learning, and community impact. Here you can see our vision and mission statements. In 2022, the Foundation Board and staff revised the vision and mission and identified guiding principles that would help reflect our desired approach to grant making. Where we can, we want to shift some of those traditional power dynamics between funders and grantees, try to be more authentic partners in the work, and uplift voices and expertise of those actually doing the work in our community. Many of us on our small team have been grants ourselves, so we definitely strive to listen, learn, and also co-create with partners that we're working with. We approach our vision and mission through these three key strategies, which I'll review. The first one is elevating community brilliance and expertise. And we do this, and we've done this recently at least, through two primary initiatives. One is our early stage operations and planning fund, where we've worked with organizations over 3 years in a cohort setting to provide technical assistance and general operation dollars to help them build some of those foundational pieces of a sustainable organization. Oftentimes, organizations get started by someone's desire to meet a need that they see in the community, and there's a lot of passion and a lot of commitment to doing good. And they might not have gotten into it to do the fundraising, to do evaluation, to clarify the work and position itself for long-term sustainability. And we know that that takes time and it takes support. And so through the early stage operations and planning fund, we have been providing that to organizations who are earlier in their development, not necessarily startup organizations, but organizations who may have been around for a while but need that work to make their organization more sustainable. The other way we have been operationalizing this strategy is through our Brilliant Leaders Fellowship, which over the last couple of years, we've had two cohorts of leaders of nonprofit orgs come together. And really, it's less about leadership development explicitly, but more about rest and a space for reflection about what kind of leadership is needed to support organizations and staffs in our community. And so that's been one way that we feel that we can support leaders and lift up the good work that's already happening. The next strategy, strategic partnership to meet community needs. This is actually where the bulk of our grant making happens. And what this strategy looks like is this is where we receive requests from community organizations for support, and we make grants to support that work. The third strategy is systemic change and movement building. And this is really about foundation-led initiatives and how we're using our position in the philanthropic ecosystem to try to change practices, to influence policies that we think are important based on the learning that we've done with partners through the strategy I just was talking about and partnering with different organizations. So, regardless of which strategy we're talking about, something that's consistent across all of it is that we try to assume a posture of learning and transparency, really focus on how we work with organizations to provide resources beyond the check. Money is good. Don't get me wrong. That's not lost on me, but also how can we use our networks and our position to uplift the work that's happening in our community. And lift up the stories of impact that are happening out there. Today, I'll focus primarily on the strategy where the majority of our resources go, and that's the strategic partnership to meet community needs. People, learning, and partnership are some of the guiding principles behind this strategy. And we see ourselves as a learning organization. And what we're trying to do is understand what's working, what's maybe not as successful through our partners, using that learning to evaluate and inform our own work. And so we really do see it as a partnership and want to make sure that we're providing the organizations with what they need, whether that's the funding and our relationships with other networks, um, and how we can do that to make greater impact together. Like I said, our staff have been grant seekers too, and because of that, we want to make this process as transparent and as simplified as possible for everybody. Next, I'll talk about where our grant making resources are focused. Last fall, we reflected on the past 5 years of grant making and then also what was going on in our community and different things shaping the nonprofit sector in recent years. And so we adjusted our priorities and landed on these three pillars. One is defending and strengthening public education. The second, whole child learning and whole family supports. And lastly, post-secondary access and support. And what you'll see is a common thread here where we see ourselves at that intersection of K-12 public education, children, and families. All of our work, we are a place-based funder in Kent County, so all of our partners are doing work that directly impacts Kent County, Michigan. A request doesn't have to necessarily hit all three focus areas, but it is more likely to be supported if it has some kind of shared focus on public education, children and their families of school-age youth, or young adults transitioning to post-secondary. If it doesn't mean the work isn't important. It just means that we're likely not a good fit for partnership because that's where we're focusing our resources. Again, not a judgment on the work, but we also just simply receive more requests than we can support. And so sometimes that requires some difficult decisions. Here is a snippet from our webpage that details a little bit more what we mean by these three pillars. It's by no means meant to be an exhaustive list, but we've identified some priority areas. In the first pillar of defending and strengthening public education, you'll see some themes around professional development, strengthening the educator pipeline, and youth and family leadership. The first pillar is really focused on things that are happening inside of the schools and how to support that school culture. The second pillar, whole child learning and whole family supports. This is really a reflection of the idea that we know for students to be successful, their families need to be stable too. And so this is going to highlight two-gen approaches where both young people and their caregivers are learning or being supported in some way together. This is also inclusive of out of school time or after school and summer learning programs, knowing that that's such a critical time that families need beyond the school day for their kids to have access to enrichment opportunities and maybe other supplemental academic opportunities too. This also, you'll notice it has a focus on stabilization efforts for immigrant and refugee students. Right now, we recognize that this is a heightened need in what's going on today, and that is a community that needs some special focus. And then lastly, the post-secondary access and success pillar is primarily targeted towards 18 and 24-year-olds. We're focused on those young adults who have finished high school and are needing some supports as they make those decisions about higher ed and extending their learning after high school. I've included the website here where you can see in more detail our grant making priorities and a rationale for that. On this slide, I've also included a graphic from Ascend out of the Aspen Institute. They have what they call a two-generation approach and different components to that approach. And if this is something that you're not familiar with, I highly recommend it. It has really shaped how we think about what it means to support families more holistically and has served as an influence in how we are investing our time and resources too. So, highly recommend this if it's something that you're not familiar with. I'll talk about requests that are not eligible for support. Obviously, you can see this list here. It's also available on our website. Um, I think some things to lift up here would be around sponsorships. We get a lot of requests for sponsorships, but that's not a space that we are in at the moment. We are really more focused on programs and services that are sustained and working with children and families over time versus one-time events. So even if the event happens on an annual basis, we're really not in the event supports area. And so if you've got a request for something like that, we're probably not going to be a good fit there. One of the things I'd like to also lift up is if an organization is rooted in faith-based principles, you're not excluded from grant consideration, but any request for support would need to ensure that the programming and services are separate from any spiritual or religious activities, and no one is required to make any statement of faith or sign off that they adhere to a specific belief system of any kind to participate in the program or feel pressure to either. So it's something to consider there. A question that we often get is, what do you look for in a request? And this has a lot of components to it, but assuming that there's some alignment in the fact that it's the proposed activities supports Kent County communities and is connected in some way to those pillars, whether it's public education, children, youth, and family outcomes, post-secondary education. We also look at a number of other factors. We're looking to understand if the organization is aligned with our values and guiding principles, how it operates in the community. Is that aligned with how we want to operate? We're going to look at if whether or not the work is informed by the community that's being served in some way. How was the need determined, and do the people that it seeks to serve want the programming that is being proposed? We're also going to want to understand the organization's approach to outcomes and learning. How does it think about success? How does it think about impact? And that's going to look very differently depending on the size of the organization too. So it's not a one way to do it, but we're going to want to learn more about that. In terms of organizational capacity, we're also going to want to know how the staffing looks and how it is going to implement the work that is outlined in a request. Is the budget realistic to what the scope of the work is? And do you have the people and other things that need to be in place to implement that? Another thing that we're going to be wanting to understand is where that organization feels like it's positioned in its respective ecosystem. So if you are providing an out-of-school time program, how does that organization fit with other organizations in the out-of-school time space? Or oftentimes an organization is situated in multiple ecosystems. And so where does the organization see itself? Is it filling a gap? Does it complement existing efforts? And an extension of that is we want to kind of think about how it fits in our entire portfolio too. Where would this work support learning that another organization is doing? And so all of those things help us determine whether or not there's a good fit. Very rarely do we get a request that is an absolute, a misalignment. There's oftentimes some aspect that connects, but maybe not quite. But we're wanting to look at every request in a holistic way. Next, I'll talk about how to engage with us and apply for funding, what the actual process looks like. So before you start, I would recommend that you're assessing alignment with those priorities that I just reviewed. Another way that you can do that is to also look at our past grants on our webpage. We have posts that are shared by some of our partners. We have videos sometimes. And so that doing that and reading our annual reports will give you a sense of the type of work that we typically fund, the estimated amounts of different grants, and give you an idea of where your request might sit in relation to the things that have been funded. The other thing that you'll want to do is make sure you're checking our deadlines. We have quarterly grant cycles and timelines connected to each one of those to make sure that that fits with when you're going to time the work that's being proposed. And then lastly, determine which type of funding best fits your request. We have two different options. One is operations, programming, pilots, and projects, which is much easier to say OP3 grants. And these are going to support general operations and projects, existing and new programming, and also time-bound projects too. These grants are available for 1 to 3 years. So we do welcome multi-year requests. They will, if you have a multi-year request, there's going to be an annual report that is due, and we typically work with each partner to figure out what they're going to share out each year through the course of the grant. And these requests are also approved by our foundation directors. Those we have quarterly board meetings, and requests are presented to our board for final approval. The other fund that we have is called Rapid Response and Emerging Action. And this fund is really designed to address emerging community needs. We recognize that sometimes needs don't happen conveniently on a quarterly basis, and something pressing may come up. And there are organizations who are positioned to do something and want to do something to address those needs. And so we have this fund, which you can request up to $30,000 for 1 year for time-bound projects. Or if there's new programming that's being developed or proposed to meet that emerging need, you can request up to 2 years at $30,000 each. And I think that distinction here to note is that this is really to address a community need versus any financial emergency that one organization might have. So an example might be that, let's say I have a summer camp and it is May, and I realize that there's a funding gap and I need to fill that gap in order to run the program. I would not be a good candidate for the rapid response fund because summer learning is an established need, an ongoing need that we have because public schools aren't year round for the most part. And so there are many organizations trying to address that broad community need, and it's not a new one. So that would probably not be a candidate. However, maybe there was something that happened, like a COVID, for example, and my organization wanted to do something to organize resources to support communities for that. Now, that is responding to a broader community need and something that is needing at the time. I wanted to address it then during COVID. So that is something to keep in mind. Requests for rapid response can be accepted at any time, and this is actually at the team's discretion. So it doesn't have to be approved every quarter, and we can make these grants at any time. So Those are the two different types of funding that we offer. This is what the landing page for our website looks like. If you are looking for grants, we have different options up here at the top. And to go to our site and get some of this information that I'm sharing today, you'll go to the grants page. On that page, we have kind of the overall process for applications, as you see here. And it's basically these four steps. After you determine your fit and the type of funding that you want, you're going to register for an account with Temelio, which is our grant making platform. And when you go on the website and you click this link, then it'll take you to another page that shows you with screenshots how to register for an account. This typically takes a couple of days. Just know that it is not an immediate turnaround when you're planning on trying to access the platform. It's no more than a week, but just give it a couple of days. And then if you get approved, then you'll be sent an invitation to submit an initial inquiry. And here, this is where you're going to provide an overview of the proposed activities. You're going to provide the amount for the request and give us some basic information about the work. This process, once you submit it, typically takes about 2 weeks for a decision, or oftentimes I will set up a follow-up call. I know that it can be challenging to convey everything in a text box, and so if something feels unclear or we want to have a conversation about it, I'll set up a follow-up call and we'll review the request. Like I said, after this has been submitted, you will hear from me sometime within the 2 weeks of submission, one way or another. After that, if I share all the notes from the meetings with the team, we determine which applications move forward in our application process. If it moves forward, then you have a link to complete a full application in Temelio, and this varies from 3 to 6 weeks, depending on when your initial inquiry was approved for you to have time to do. And this is going to ask for more detailed information, information about the board, budgets, etc. After that, then we'll set up a time to review the application for the same reason we did with the inquiry. We want to just clarify all the parts of the application to make sure we're understanding it and representing it accurately. We take that to the board on their scheduled meeting date, and if approved, an organization would receive funding within 2 weeks after that. So this kind of gives you an overview, not only of the process, but the timeline for each step too. Speaking of timelines, this can also be found on our website, but this details when initial inquiries are due and then dates for applications if an organization is invited, and then when the board decision is made. I often feel like it's sometimes easier to go backwards, is to determine when the board meeting is, when funding might be dispersed if you are successful through the process, and then work your way backwards. One thing I would note here is that even though this is the final deadline, I highly recommend submitting initial inquiry well before the deadline, because it just means it gives us some more time to thoughtfully review the request with you. And then if it gets approved, you'll have more time to complete the application, because you'll notice the dates between the inquiries and the application is about a month. And so if you don't submit your inquiry until this date, and then it takes 2 weeks to get something set up for a follow-up, then you've cut in on that time to complete an application, and you end up putting your organization in more of a time crunch. So highly recommend submitting an inquiry well before the due date. We are currently accepting inquiries for our January 2027 grant cycle. That is due at the end of September. Some general tips for the initial inquiry: be concise. I learned a while back from a successful grant writer to read the question, respond directly to the question, and just be direct. And now, as someone reading a lot of requests, I really appreciate it when organizations do just that. You don't get any style points here. It's just helping us understand what the work is and including enough to help us do that, but it doesn't have to be inclusive of everything you've ever written about the work either. And so read the question and answer it as directly as possible. The second point here is trying to also convey the importance of conveying the need that your organization is meeting through the work that it's proposing. Why is your organization best positioned to address that need? And how was the need determined? Like who determined that this was even a need? And so helping us understand that is something to include in the overview for the request as well. As you're talking about the work, it's important to focus not just on the activities and the how, but also what is the desired outcome and what are the outcomes that your organization through this work can directly impact. Sometimes there is a longer term outcome that is expressed in an initial inquiry, but we also want to know, well, what are the shorter term and more immediate outcomes of the work? Another piece would be to communicate why you think this would be a good partnership with the Steelcase Foundation. Not all funders are the same, and so it's helpful for us to know why you think working with us is important and desired, besides obviously the check. But we really want to, because we emphasize and believe in partnership, we want to understand why your organization thinks it would be a good fit. And then finally, including realistic budget estimates. If your organization's budget is 50,000 right now, but the request is for 100,000, I'm going to have a lot of questions on why that is. And so, also related is, does the amount of the work feel proportional to the scope of the work that is being proposed as well. So kind of think about that, keep that in mind as you're working on your initial inquiry. Some other frequently asked questions that we get that's related to budget that I just talked about is how much should we request? And there's no one answer here because again, we're really thinking about how the amount is in relation to the organization's size, its capacity to do the work, and the scope of the work. There's no formal minimum request, but I think just a very, very rough rule that I've often shared with organizations is, determine what it costs to do the work that you're proposing and request no more than half. Have we funded more than half of a request before? Yes. Have we funded less than that? Yes. But it's a good starting point. We just would prefer not to be the sole funder of any program because if something were to happen, we don't want to put the organization in a tough spot by losing the sole funder of that work. And so keeping that in mind, where that's a good place to start, at least for a request. Can we apply for general operations funding? Yes, we do offer that through OP3, and we often do that with organizations that have strong alignment across their organization to our mission, our values, our guiding principles, and our funding priorities. That being said, if you apply for a programming grant, it's very generous in that any expense that's connected to that program, whether that's staffing, other indirect costs can be included in that. And so our programming grants are also as flexible as they can be, as long as it's connected to that program. A question about whether or not the organization has to be based in Kent County. We do have some partners who have a statewide focus in Michigan or are even nationally based, but where organizations are strongest when that's the case is if they have a physical presence somehow in Kent County. They have some staff that are based here. And that really reflects our desire to ensure that people doing the work have a connection to the community, just like we do. We are based here, and we just know how important that is to have that physical presence in the community. What about capital campaigns? We get a lot of requests for capital campaigns, and where we like to support organizations who are undergoing a campaign like that is to support ongoing operations and programming. And so rather than focus on the capital campaign, we're going to be more focused on supporting your ongoing programming needs. And then finally, the last question on this slide is my school's, let's say, robotics team eligible for funding? That is listed on our things that aren't eligible. And so we don't do that type of funding. We're really looking more at organizations who are doing broader programming than individual teams or school clubs. I think generally, if you have a question and you aren't sure if it's a good fit or something wasn't on this slide, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. So send me an email, give me a call, and we can talk through it. Welcome all conversations before you apply. I thought this question deserved its own slide. Why was our inquiry declined? The answer here is like, we receive a lot more requests than we can fund. And so we have to make some hard decisions. And oftentimes it doesn't move forward because maybe the alignment with our priorities is limited relative to the other requests that we're getting. Maybe the geographic focus is not aligned with ours in Kent County. Some parts of the proposal aren't fully defined. Maybe it's a pilot or an organization is trying something new. We're supportive of that, but where we typically come in for new programming is when an organization has already tried some aspects of it. And they're wanting to scale it up or include a new partner. But if it doesn't move forward, it may be because partners haven't been established or curriculum isn't there. And so that is oftentimes a reason why a request doesn't move on to the application stage. And then the last two, I think, are connected because we have limited resources. We're going to be looking at our current portfolio of investments and partnerships too. And so maybe at the time that we get a particular request, we already are doing something. And that's not to say we don't have similar programs in our portfolio doing similar work. It's just we're going to take that into account, and maybe at that time, that's not where we're focused, and we've prioritized something else. So timing is also a factor that is included in our funding decisions too. Again, if you've got some questions that I did not address in this session, please feel free to email me, give me a call, set up a meeting, visit our website at steelcasefoundation.org and explore some of the resources that we've tried to put there to help folks understand how we approach our work. And if there's something that is still not clear, just don't hesitate to reach out to any of us. Thank you.